Madeleine Force Astor was 18 years old, 5 months pregnant, and a widow on the North Atlantic the morning the Titanic went down. And the will her husband had signed 7 months earlier contained a clause that would cost her $3,571,036 for the act of remarrying, and nobody alive on that lifeboat could have told her why a dead man had written it. She was not the richest person aboard that ship. That was her husband. John Jacob Astor IV carried a fortune of close to $87 million, a figure that places near $2.9 billion in today's currency, and by every reliable account, he was the richest passenger on the Titanic. In the early hours of April 15th, 1912, he died and left behind a young wife, an unborn child, and a legal instrument that would govern both of their lives from beyond the grave. That number, $3,571,036, converts to close to $100 million today. It was the price of a second marriage. Not a reckless venture or a lawsuit, a wedding. Of that fortune, $69 million went to his son Vincent without conditions. Every condition fell on Madeleine alone. She could keep the mansion, the trust income, the horses, and the summer estate, or she could fall in love. The will made those two things incompatible. The instrument that governed her was not a court order, and it was not a contract negotiated between living parties. It was a will, signed 9 days after the wedding it was designed to govern, by a man who would be dead within 7 months of writing it. The clause inside would follow Madeleine Force Astor for the rest of her life, and she would choose to break it. But this is not the story of how the Astors built their wealth. That arc, the immigrant fur trader, the Manhattan ground leases, the Fifth Avenue mansions, is documented elsewhere. This story begins with a specific man, a specific document, and the 18-year-old girl who married him 9 days before he put that document in front of his lawyers. His first wife was Ava Lowell Willing, a Philadelphia socialite. They divorced in 1909. Ava received a reported $10 million in the settlement, a sum that would have been extraordinary for any American divorce of that era. The end of the marriage did not pass without comment. Society talked about it in public and at length. And then John Jacob Astor IV did the one thing guaranteed to keep society talking. He began courting a teenager named Madeleine Talmadge Force. Madeleine was born on June 19, 1893, in Brooklyn. Her father, William Hurlburt Force, worked in the shipping business. Her mother, Catherine Arvilla Talmadge, was the granddaughter of a former Brooklyn mayor. The family was comfortable, not wealthy. Nothing in Madeleine's upbringing had prepared her for the scale of the fortune she was about to enter, or for the document that would come with it. John Jacob Astor IV was 47 years old when he began courting her. She was 17, the age gap was 29 years. And from his first marriage, he had a son, Vincent Astor, born on November 15, 1891, which made Madeleine less than 2 years younger than her future stepson. She would marry a man and at once acquire a stepchild who was close to her own age. The announcement was published in the society columns and denounced from the pulpit within days. He was a divorced man in an era when divorce itself carried social weight, and the age of his intended bride made the combination impossible to ignore. Ministers preached against the match by name. From Newport to Manhattan, the couple was discussed in drawing rooms as if the engagement were a public offense. Multiple clergymen refused to perform the ceremony. The scandal of the divorce was fresh, the age gap was inescapable, and no minister of social standing wanted his name attached to the union. The man who agreed was Reverend Joseph Lambert, a Congregationalist minister from Providence, Rhode Island. Lambert performed the wedding on September 9, 1911, at Beechwood, the Astor estate in Newport. Madeleine was 18. John Jacob Astor IV was 47. Lambert left the church 2 months later, in November of 1911, to go into business, according to published accounts. Whether the controversy of that particular wedding played any part in his departure has never been established. But the timing was noted. 9 days after the wedding, on September 18, 1911, John Jacob Astor IV signed his will. The provisions for Madeleine were substantial in total and conditional in every important detail. She would receive $100,000 outright. That sum carried no conditions. It was hers regardless of anything she did or failed to do. Beyond that, she would receive income from a $5 million trust fund, the use of the family mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the use of Beechwood in Newport, a limousine, and 5 horses. Every one of those provisions, except the $100,000, came with the same condition. If Madeleine Force Astor remarried, she would forfeit them all. Trust income, mansions, vehicles, horses. All of it would revert to the Astor estate. The newlyweds left the country after the wedding. They traveled to Egypt and through Europe on an extended honeymoon, and the reason for going abroad was in part romantic and in part strategic. The gossip in New York had not subsided, and distance was the easiest way to let the talk fade. In Egypt, they toured the ancient sites along the Nile. In Paris, they attended the opera and shopped the couturiers. The European press covered their movements with the same interest the American papers had shown, but at a distance, and without the moral outrage. For a few months, the Astors were just rich Americans abroad, while overseas, Madeleine became pregnant, and the pregnancy changed the itinerary. John Jacob Astor IV wanted the child born in the United States, in New York, on home ground, not in a hotel in Cairo. That is how they came to book 3 first-class cabins aboard a ship called the Titanic, departing Cherbourg on April 10, 1912. Madeleine was 5 months pregnant. They were traveling with an Airedale Terrier named Kitty, a private nurse, and a maid. The passage was routine. They were going home to have the baby. 4 nights later, on the evening of April 14, 1912, the ship struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. What happened over the next 2.5 hours would determine what became of $87 million. It would determine whether the will John Jacob Astor IV had signed 7 months earlier would ever take effect, and it would determine whether Madeleine Force Astor would ever face the choice the remarriage clause was designed to force. When the order came to evacuate, the Astors were directed to the boat deck. At Lifeboat number 4, John Jacob Astor IV helped his pregnant wife climb in. Then he asked Second Officer Charles Lightoller if he could accompany her. Lightoller's answer, recorded by the survivor Archibald Gracie IV, was direct. "No, sir. No man is allowed on this boat or any of the boats until the ladies are off." John Jacob Astor IV stepped back from the lifeboat. There was no argument, no second request. On the starboard bridge wing of the Titanic, he was last seen standing beside the writer Jacques Futrelle, smoking a cigarette. After that, nobody saw him alive again. In the early hours of April 15, 1912, he was gone. Madeleine, 18, pregnant, survived in Lifeboat number 4. The Carpathia rescued her. 1 week later, on April 22nd, his body was recovered from the North Atlantic by the cable ship Mackay Bennett. Identification came from the initials sewn into his jacket lining. Among his personal effects was a gold pocket watch. Vincent Astor, his 20-year-old son from the first marriage, would take that watch and wear it for the rest of his life. Nobody on Lifeboat number 4 had known what was inside the will. The document had been signed the previous September, before the voyage, before the pregnancy had advanced far enough for anyone to plan around it. Its terms were known to the attorneys and to the family. But the price of the remarriage clause, the precise figure Madeleine would pay for triggering it, had not been calculated. That calculation would come later. What the clause would cost her when she triggered it would exceed what the Atlantic took from her that night. Madeleine came ashore from the Carpathia as the most famous widow in America, and she was younger than her own stepson. Vincent Astor had been born in November of 1891. Madeleine had been born in June of 1893. Fewer than 2 years separated them in age. The stepmother was the younger of the two. On August 14, 1912, 4 months after the sinking, Madeleine gave birth to John Jacob Astor VI. Newspapers called him the Titanic baby. The will, probated on May 17th, was reprobated on September 10th of that year to incorporate provisions for the child who had not existed when the document was drafted. The boy received a $3 million trust fund to be held until his 21st birthday. By 1933, when he turned 21, the trust had grown to $5 million. For the moment, Madeleine had everything the will promised. Income from the $5 million trust. The family mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue, a French Renaissance chateau designed by Richard Morris Hunt, completed in 1896, occupying the northeast corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street in Manhattan. The mansion was a double residence, one of the grandest private houses in the city, and the southern half was hers under the will. Beechwood and Newport, a limousine, 5 horses, her infant son beside her, all of it belonged to her in the legal sense, as long as one condition held: she could not remarry. The moment she walked into a church with another man, every conditional provision would revert to the Astor estate. The mansion would pass to Vincent. Trust income would stop. The Newport estate, the vehicles, the household staff, the entire apparatus of a Gilded Age widow's life would vanish. The myth that grew around Madeleine's story inflated the number beyond recognition. Competing accounts claim she walked away from the entire Astor fortune, that she forfeited billions, that she gave up one of the largest inheritances in American history. None of that is documented. The actual figure, published in the New York Times around June of 1916, breaks down into 3 components. First, the actuarial value of her life interest in the $5 million trust was $1,094,199. Second, the mansion was appraised at $1,974,627, and the furnishings inside it were appraised at $502,210, $1,094,199, plus $1,974,627, plus $502,210. The total is $3,571,036. That is the documented cost, not a round estimate, a number built from 3 separate appraised values and published in the newspaper of record. What she kept without conditions was $100,000, no clause attached. In practical terms, she traded close to 97% of her Astor provisions for the right to choose her own life. On June 22, 1916, at St. Saviour's Episcopal Church in Bar Harbor, Maine, Madeleine Force Astor married William Carl Dick. Dick was a childhood friend, a banker who served as vice president of Manufacturers Trust Company. Madeleine was 23 years old. She had been a widow for 4 years and 2 months. The will activated the moment the ceremony ended. Trust income reverted to the Astor estate. The mansion passed to Vincent. Use of Beechwood ended. The limousine, the horses, the furnishings valued at $502,210. All of it gone. $3,571,036, erased by a marriage certificate signed in a church in Maine. The will had been signed in a law office in September of 1911. 4 years later, after its author had died on the floor of the North Atlantic, it did what it was written to do. Consider what that meant for a woman of 23. She had survived the most famous maritime disaster in modern history. She had given birth to a child whose father died before seeing him. For 4 years, she had lived inside a fortune she could keep on one condition: that she remain alone. And then she decided the money was not worth the condition it carried. The sum she forfeited was several lifetimes of wages, enough to build a house, fill it with staff, and live without working for decades. She walked away from it for the right to choose her own life, and if you have ever weighed a safe choice against a free one, the scale she held was the same one. The numbers were just larger. What remained was the unconditional sum. In 1916, that amount was not trivial. It was comfortable. But placed beside what she had given up, it was a fraction of a fraction. Ava Lowell Willing, the first wife, had received $10 million in the divorce settlement. Under the will, the daughter from that first marriage, Ava Alice Muriel Astor, received a $10 million trust fund. The Titanic baby, John Jacob Astor VI, held a $3 million trust that would reach $5 million by the time he turned 21. Madeleine, the second wife, the woman who had survived the Titanic at 18 and carried the Astor name through the most documented shipwreck in history, walked away with $100,000, a fraction of what the first wife received, a fraction of what her own infant son would hold. And then there was Vincent. $69 million landed on him the day his father died. Free and clear, no remarriage clause, no restrictions, no conditions of any kind. At 20 years old, he was one of the richest men in America, and he was watching all of this unfold from the other side of the will's design. What he would do with that fortune over the next 47 years is something nobody in 1916 could have predicted. The marriage to William Dick was, by every external measure, quieter than anything Madeleine had experienced since boarding the Titanic. Society pages lost interest. The woman who had been Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV was now Mrs. William Dick, a banker's wife, and the machinery of New York society found other subjects to discuss. They lived in comfort, though not at the scale Madeleine had known inside the Astor household. During those 17 years, the question of what she had surrendered hung over the household without ever being spoken aloud. She raised her son in a world adjacent to the fortune that bore his name but no longer supported his mother. The boy grew up holding a trust that was growing toward $5 million, substantial on its own but a shadow of what Vincent managed across town. The marriage lasted 17 years. On July 21st, 1933, Madeleine divorced William Dick in Reno, Nevada. She was 40 years old. The will governed a living woman from beyond the grave, and the remarriage clause was never about protecting Madeleine. It was about protecting the fortune from a second husband. A widow who remarries brings a new man into the financial orbit of the estate. A new husband might claim dower rights or spend capital or father additional heirs, further dividing an inheritance that was being distributed across multiple branches. The clause was a financial instrument whose purpose was to keep the Astor money inside the Astor bloodline for as long as possible. Whether that purpose justified governing the life of an 18-year-old girl who had just watched her husband die on a sinking ship was a question no clause in the document addressed. 4 months after the Reno divorce, on November 27, 1933, Madeleine married for the third time. His name was Enzo Fiermonte. He was an Italian boxer born in 1908. She was 40. He was 25. The age gap was 15 years, running in the opposite direction from her first marriage. The wedding took place in a hospital room at Doctors Hospital in New York City. Madeleine was recovering from a broken shoulder. The ceremony was small and improvised, held at her bedside. There was no Newport estate behind her, no society pages covering the event with reverence, and no Astor name on the invitation in any meaningful sense. The Astor apparatus had been gone for 17 years. Society did not respond with kindness. The combination of the age difference, the hospital setting, and the groom's profession generated the kind of coverage Madeleine had spent 2 decades trying to avoid. Newspapers that had once documented her rescue from the Titanic now documented her marriage to a boxer in a hospital bed. The marriage lasted less than 5 years. On June 11, 1938, Madeleine divorced Enzo Fiermonte in West Palm Beach, Florida, on grounds of extreme cruelty. Published accounts alleged he had been violent during the marriage, that he had broken her bones. After the divorce, Fiermonte sold his version of the marriage to the tabloid True Story. The distance from 845th Avenue to a tabloid column measured less than 22 years. In 1916, she had walked away from a French Renaissance chateau and the income of a $5 million trust. In 1938, she was recovering from a broken marriage in Florida, while her former husband sold the details to a scandal magazine. That coverage was a sharp humiliation. Madeleine had spent most of her adult life among people who treated discretion as a social obligation. The pages of True Story were as far from 845th Avenue as the same city could offer. Madeleine Force Astor died on March 27, 1940, in Palm Beach, Florida. She was 46 years old. The official cause of death was cardiovascular disease. What she left behind tells the end of the story better than any summary. To her son, John Jacob Astor VI, she left a diamond solitaire ring valued at $50,000 and a pearl necklace valued at $1,525, a ring and a strand of pearls. That was the material estate of the Titanic Widow, 28 years after she had climbed into Lifeboat number 4 on the most documented night in maritime history. The chateau where she had once lived under the terms of the will had been demolished in 1926. Temple Emmanuel, a synagogue, was built on the site and dedicated on January 10, 1930. The structure the will had once lent her no longer existed. Her son would cross paths with the other side of the will's design. After Vincent Astor died in 1959, John Jacob Astor VI filed suit against the estate, claiming that Vincent had been incompetent in his final years. The suit was settled for $250,000, $250,000 from a fortune that had once been appraised at $87 million. Madeleine was buried at Trinity Church Cemetery in Manhattan in a mausoleum beside her mother. She was 46. Her husband had died at 47. The Titanic Widow outlived the Titanic by 28 years, and she outlived her husband's fortune. in every sense that mattered to her daily life by 24. The question the story leaves behind is whether the remarriage clause was unusual. It was not. Conditional provisions for widows were standard instruments in Gilded Age estate planning. A wealthy man drafting a will in 1911 would have been advised by his attorneys, as a matter of routine, to include language that revoked certain provisions upon remarriage. The concern was the same in every case. A widow who took a second husband brought a new legal person into the orbit of the estate. That person might claim rights or spend from the principal, or produce children who would further divide the inheritance. As a legal device, the clause was ordinary. What separates Madeleine's case from the thousands of similar provisions written into wills across that era is the receipt. 3 separately appraised values adding to one published total, each assessed on its own terms, adding to a precise sum that appeared in print. There is no cleaner receipt of what a Gilded Age remarriage clause cost a specific woman anywhere in the public record. But the will was not about Madeleine. It was never about Madeleine. To read the full instrument is to understand that every provision concerning the second wife served a single structural purpose, and that purpose was Vincent. John Jacob Astor IV built his estate to concentrate the fortune in one pair of hands. Vincent received $69 million of the $87 million gross estate, and he received it without restrictions. No remarriage clause, not a single behavioral condition, nothing that could revoke it. The entire accumulated weight of 4 generations of Astor land, Astor rent, and Astor hotel revenue settled onto a 20-year-old with nothing attached. Madeleine's provisions ran in the opposite direction, conditional and revocable, designed to prevent a second husband from entering the financial picture. The will sorted the heirs into 2 roles. Vincent received the fortune outright, a pool to be managed and invested by a single steward across whatever years he had. Madeleine received the use of certain assets under conditions that functioned as long as she remained unmarried and not a day longer. The architecture was deliberate. A man who wanted his fortune to survive as a single entity, administered by one capable heir, insulated from the claims a second marriage would introduce. Whether that was wisdom or cruelty depends on which side of the clause a person stood on. The will had no opinion on the matter. Vincent Astor inherited $69 million at the age of 20. He received it without conditions, without behavioral restrictions, without a single clause tying the money to his personal conduct. The fortune was his to deploy as he saw fit, and what he did with it would have puzzled his father. He did not collect rent from the Manhattan Empire the family had maintained for 4 generations. Instead, he began taking it apart. Vincent sold off the slum housing, the tenement blocks in Lower Manhattan that had earned earlier Astors the title Landlord of New York. The reputation that came with those properties had grown uncomfortable, and Vincent could see that the passive rent model his ancestors had perfected was running into a new century. Then he reinvested. Affordable housing went up in neighborhoods where the family had been content to collect rent without improving conditions. Portions of the fortune went toward charity. From a yacht called the Noor Mahal, 264 feet long, Vincent conducted business and entertained the political class of the Roosevelt era. Franklin Roosevelt himself was a guest. By 1937, Vincent was chairman of Newsweek magazine. 3 marriages followed. None produced children. A childhood case of mumps had left him sterile. With Vincent, the main line of the American Astors, the bloodline that carried the single largest share of the fortune, the line the will of 1911 had been designed to protect, would end. The clause that kept Madeleine from remarrying had preserved the fortune for an heir who could not produce an heir of his own, and the will had solved one problem while leaving another, with its author not alive to amend it. Vincent Astor died on February 3, 1959, of a heart attack. He left the bulk of his estate not to relatives, but to the Vincent Astor Foundation. Under the chairmanship of his third wife, Brooke Astor, the foundation gave away close to $200 million before closing in 1997. The will of 1911 concentrated the fortune in one pair of hands for one more generation. It kept the money out of reach of a second marriage. Whether that single generation of consequence justified the cost borne by a teenage widow on a lifeboat is a question the will was never built to consider. A will is the last instrument a person signs. It speaks after the author is gone and cannot be argued with, because the person who drafted it is no longer available to explain what was intended or to adjust what was written. Every provision is a final instruction, and every clause is a decision frozen in the moment it was signed. immune to appeal, and immune to whatever circumstances develop in the decades after the author dies. What the Astor will did was keep the fortune whole by treating a living woman as a variable to be contained. Income, mansions, horses, a limousine. All of it granted as controlled generosity, revocable the moment the variable changed state. None of it belonged to Madeleine. It belonged to the estate of a dead man, and it was lent to her under terms she could not negotiate and could not alter. That mechanism repeats across the Gilded Age, and understanding it is the reason this story matters beyond the Astors. The great fortunes of that era were preserved or destroyed by the legal instruments that governed them after their founders died. The families that held their wealth together, the Rockefellers with their trusts, the DuPonts with their holding companies, did so through structures that outlived any single heir's judgment or appetite. Those that lost their wealth, the Vanderbilts, the Woolworths, did it by leaving the pile unguarded, divided across too many heirs, without a legal structure to hold the center. By any measurable standard, the Astor will was not a failure. It achieved what it was designed to achieve, preserving the fortune for one more generation and leaving a woman to choose between security and independence. She chose independence, and the cost was documented to the dollar. Madeleine Force was 18 when she married the richest passenger on the Titanic, 18 when she became a widow on a lifeboat in the North Atlantic, 23 when she walked into a church in Bar Harbor, Maine, and signed away the trust, the mansion, the Newport estate, and everything except $100,000, 40 when she divorced for the second time, 46 when she died in Palm Beach, leaving behind a diamond ring worth $50,000 and a pearl necklace worth $1,525. The will outlived them both. It outlived John Jacob Astor IV, who died in the North Atlantic at 47. It outlived Madeleine, who died of heart disease in Florida at 46. And it delivered the fortune, intact, to the one heir it was designed to protect, who used it for a generation and then gave it away to strangers.